Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Michael Ignatiadis. Good afternoon, Mr. Michael. Hi. Mr. Michael, are you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you so much for your time and contribution and joy with our symposium today. So I give this floor for you.
Thank you for the introduction, and great to be here. So over the next half an hour, I will be discussing on how to decide where to locate your future warehouse and what to consider in order to future-proof it. So you might be thinking, why am I showing a photo of this restaurant with a nice view? But actually, it's not a restaurant, a typical restaurant. It's a restaurant in a warehouse. It's and not any warehouse. This is the Amagasaki warehouse in Osaka. It's a state-of-the-art distribution center developed by ESR, and it focuses heavily on sustainability, on human-centered design. It even has a childcare center inside. So this is an example of your warehouse of the future. These multi-story, this is 6-story buildings, which are built not just to house products and move them in and out as fast as possible, but also to accommodate people who work there and include the right automation to make their lives easier and the operations more efficient as well. So this, for example, is the largest domestic consumption logistics project in Japan, actually in a whole of APAC as well. And interestingly, almost 70% of this warehouse was already pre-leased prior to completion. So you might be asking, why don't we see more of these warehouses in Southeast Asia, excluding Singapore? But this will come. I'll talk a bit later on the trends we see that are driving some of these changes we'll see in the future. So for this session, I'll be discussing the trends that are shaping the future supply chain networks and try to answer these two questions. So where do I locate my warehouse? So thinking a bit outside the four walls of the warehouse. And then how do I future-proof my warehouse strategy? So how, within the four walls, what should my warehouse look like? What should I invest to be able to accommodate my operations for at least 5 to 10 years? And we see that constant volatility and supply chains that are very customer-driven. That means that companies need to constantly change and adapt their footprint. From a real estate perspective, when we talk with developers, investors, and owners of logistics real estate, they can no longer tweak it every 5 to 7 years. This is something they constantly have to be kind of very close to the changes on the ground. And indeed, a year ago, nobody really talked about supply chains, right? So everybody knows, what's happened with pandemic and in the impact of logistics. Beforehand, everybody expected them to work and deliver the products, but now definitely it's on everyone's mind, and businesses are thinking, what should their supply chain real estate look like, and what are the things they need to do to address the disruption. So let's start with the location, and let's look at some of the challenges that affect the location of a warehouse. So you see, many of these are pretty familiar with you all around. So from your global trade uncertainty, which we saw that with the US-China war, skill shortages and higher wages, and we've seen this here in Asia over the last 10, 15 years, where lower, so products like apparel have moved from China to Vietnam to Cambodia, and later will also move to Africa. And definitely the impact on the environment and sustainability and congestion. And finally, the anything, anywhere, anytime retail. So the expectation of the consumer that's being it's being higher and higher, and it impacts supply chains and logistics. Now, we could actually divide these challenges and some which impact more beyond the city, and some which impact within the city. So logistics beyond and within. So if we look at the more kind of high level and the macro view, you see here this table that shows the different kind of disruptions we've had over time. So over the last 20 years, starting with the September 11 attacks and coming to the ever given canal blockage. Now, all these have a different impact to the supply chain. So they impact differently your ability to supply, your transportation, your internal operations, people, communications, your financial resources, and your ability to distribute to your final customer. And of course, the duration and the impact of the duration is different. If we take into account, the ever given Suez Canal blockage, you can see here that the majority of the impact was in supply and definitely in transportation. So the high global impact there. Now, as a supply chain professional, you might be thinking, okay, these disruptions happen every few years, and they are a bit of a black swan events, right? It's difficult, a lot of them, to anticipate. So how do I address that? What do I do? So a simple but not necessarily easy way to assess your vulnerability to capacity losses is to look at your time to recover, TTR, and your time to survive. So TTR measures the time taken to recreate the company's lost capacity, whereas time to survive measures how long the supply chain can continue to operate before failure. So before needing to add additional resources and capacity. And to put it simply, if your TTR, your time to recover, is shorter than your time to survive, then you have a resilient supply chain. You can recreate the lost capacity before that failure reaches to your customer. Either it's your consumer or it's your business customer. But if your TTS, your time to survive, is longer than your TTR, then the difference represents the duration of outage the duration that you are not able to serve your customer, and this gap in continuity would need to be addressed. So from a real estate logistics point of view, one way to help address this in the future and become more resilient is to have more locations. Either you have more locations for when you're manufacturing, or you have more locations for locating your inventory. And we have heard a lot about reshoring and onshoring from Asia back to Europe, to the US, or to Australia. So how does that work? How do you make a decision around that? If we take a scenario, and this is a scenario of a consumer electronics company, US consumer electronics, that imports from China. So what if there's a 25% tariff suddenly? So what do you do? How do you decide whether to bring production back or not? And there are multiple factors, and these are the kind of the type of projects we do as well in JLL with clients. Is that so you would have to consider here on the left, first of all, the different factors that you have to, quantitative factors that you would have to calculate. You're comparing different scenarios. So your sourcing costs, your manufacturing costs, your logistic transportation costs, your inventory carrying costs, so how much inventory you keep, your cost of capital, and finally your tariffs and taxes. So in these three scenarios, the first scenario shows what will be your total cost without tariff, and also your lead time, which that's very important. So depending on the product, your lead time, your speed to the customer is very important. And then the scenario where there's a tariff, but you continue to stay in China, and the scenario where you actually there's a type and you decide to move to a different location closer to home or to where your majority of your customers are. And as you can see here in the blue, if you move nearshore, your manufacturing costs will definitely increase. But then some of your logistics costs will reduce, and most importantly, your lead time will be reduced quite considerably. So the question here is where do you consider risk? So from the slide below, before, you saw the risk, but risk is hard to quantify, and especially when businesses do their budgeting, their plan, and their forecast for production. It's something that is hard to quantify. But as you saw before, it happens, and it happens more frequently than we think. So these kind of decisions are not easy, and they require a lot of different simulations, and that's where having visibility in your cost and your inventory and your supply chain is really important, and that's where tools and digital tool digitization is paramount. Now, let's look at the warehouse within the city, right? How supply chains are developing there. So if we look at what's been happening, what has been pushing and challenging the supply chain down to the consumer, as you well aware, during the pandemic, we saw retail closures, foot traffic drop. At the same time, the e-commerce grew, and it's still growing. It's accelerating. And a good example is that during November Singles Day, Alibaba's e-commerce sales were double versus 2019. Versus 2020. So really, you can tell that e-commerce is not stopping, it's growing, and even 2021, their growth is accelerating. Now, e-commerce though requires a different kind of logistics real estate compared to traditional distribution center. It requires almost 3 times the space, because now we are talking about picking one item and putting it in a basket. So we're moving away from pallets, and that requires more manual labor. So even if you go to a Amazon warehouse in the US or in the UK, you'll still need you will still see hundreds of people packing and packages, and especially in the last mile, everything's manual. And everything remains manual, especially in Asia. The costs they don't allow the business case to have automation and micro fulfillment for that last mile. So we've come from the linear model, the past linear model, to the omni-channel model, and that's going to be becoming even more complicated in the future. So I'm not going to go through all the different variations, but as you can expect, your typical shopping center beforehand will not be the same now and in the future. So we have moved from big pallets, big trucks, limited distribution channels to a world of anywhere, anytime fulfillment, and most importantly, anything, because the challenge is how to have a huge assortment, a very big assortment of products delivered to you in 2 hours, not to have just 1,000 SKUs. And that's where we're going to see more innovation in the future. So we have moved. So as retailers, and we saw that especially, example in the US, right? So we saw retailers exiting expensive retail space. And e-commerce taking up a bigger chunk of that space. Examples of Amazon. So Amazon did that for Sears, JCPenney's department stores, which closed during the pandemic, and they repurposed that for fulfillment. In Australia, we saw Kmart, which turned 3 of their stores into dark stores, so for micro fulfillment essentially. And look, the urban logistics is very seasonal, right? As you can expect, And this is an example, in China, where you have that last mile, which during the peaks, the holidays, it's hard to fulfill, and it creates a lot of kind of manual extra effort. So urban logistics is so during those highly peaks, the high peaks, seasonal peaks, can be quite inefficient. And that is why companies are exploring automation for high storage density. So we have Robotics, micro-fulfillment technology, which can increase picking speeds and reduce costs by almost 10 times. And the smaller footprint requirement means that you can put them in a very high dense population area. So this is the importance. So you can have a bigger assortment of products fulfilled in a very highly densely populated area where, and then sometimes you can't put a warehouse anywhere you want, right? You can't just go to a retail and previous retail store and just convert it into the warehouse. There's many constraints around licensing, regulations, traffic, etc. So this is kind of some of the trends we see, and now we are the fulfillment. So ultrafast, more and more. We saw this mostly in Europe, but essentially how we started by purely offline shopping, right? So this requires you to, you think what you want to eat in the next couple of weeks and create your list and schedule a time to go to the store, travel, find the items, check out and pay and come back. Up to until 5 years ago, we had the online shopping. So everybody's familiar with that. You go to your online e-commerce site of that supermarket, and you go through the ordering process. Usually you have a big cart, and then you will wait for your delivery to come for the products you need to buy. And usually the fastest delivery time would be 2 hours, and it can take up to a week, let's say. But now you have this ultra-fast fulfillment. So the examples of PandaMart, Gorillas as well, another big one in Europe, where you essentially they are looking for a 10 to 15 minute delivery. So quick ordering, quick delivery. And this, as you can see on the matrix on the right, of course, is their focus, and the easiest products are the urgent non-perishable products that they would address. Whereas your typical e-commerce player like Amazon are great at the non-urgent, non-perishable products. Of course, you still have the your Grabs and so those food delivery companies which go to the 7-Elevens and to the retail and pick up the products for you. But these ultra-fast deliveries require their own stores, so their own small warehouse. And this is where the supply chain real estate within the city will be changing. As this channel grows, as the demand for ultra-fast delivery grows, we'll see more of these small warehouses. They call them dark stores, close to the high dense population areas to allow for that 10 to 15 minute. And the question is, how do these companies grow? How do they find that real estate? Now, as I mentioned, there's dozens of these companies popping up, and actually they're getting huge investment. For example, Gorillas, which I mentioned before, is Berlin-based, so it has a valuation of over 1 billion now, and he actually raised also 300 million recently, including from China's Tencent. Foodpanda rapidly growing very aggressively across Southeast Asia and Thailand. And then you have Getir, which is this one, which is one of the biggest. It has a valuation of $2.6 billion. So their strategy right now is to capture customers understand the behavior and expand and cross-sell as much as they can, but they do have challenges. So logistics and distribution for that last mile is very hard, and it's hard to be profitable. So there's quite a few challenges. It's hard to predict how much inventory you need to have in each of your dark stores. And then at least from a developer point of view is how do you actually expand into, let's say you're in Thailand, how do you expand your footprint to have 100 dark stores in a whole of Thailand? So that will require for you to really, because the requirement is quite, it's 300 square meters of space, a 3 meter ceiling, allowance for your racks, potentially for your scooters to come in and pick up. So there are requirements, but they're not complicated enough to make it easy for, let's say, JLL to find those, right? It's a very specific, simple requirements, and as the cost has to be very low, and you have a very big number of those dark stores you need to acquire. This is one of the challenges that these ultra-fast delivery companies are facing at the moment. Now, how does that fulfillment model look? So the traditional fulfillment, as you can see at the top, involves a manufacturer shipping their products either from their own warehouse or through a distributor to a retail DC, and then to the retail store, and then to the consumer. Easy. Now with the dark stores, what you have is the goods. This is Flipkart, the example in India, where they would have their own DC. They will have more centralized DC, which will feed to the dark store that's close to the consumer, and so that's the second version. The last one is where you have, and this is what Foodpanda, for example, does, is that it just has dark stores directly. It gets replenished from the distributor warehouse or the manufacturer warehouse, and it has hundreds of those dark stores that fulfill the final demand. So they kind of 7-Eleven stores, but without access to the public. So to conclude, we talked about location, and we talked about when we look at location around finding the right supply chain network for your company and the disruptions and how to become resilient, and then how do supply chains look within cities, and what will the disruption be for those supply chains? So very different requirement, but it's interesting to from a real estate perspective to address that. Now let's look at within the four walls of a warehouse, and how do you future-proof? How do you invest in the right warehouse with the right automation and fit-outs? Now we see that so we saw earlier 6 key drivers that were shaping supply chain networks in the beginning, that were all about the location. So how do I future-proof my logistics footprint? I would say there are 2 key drivers that are really on top of mind for everyone. One is the automation and robotics adoption that we see growing, and the other is the sustainability commitments. So the automation and robotics at the moment, we do see it more for e-commerce players. That's at least what you see in the news, those big box, JD.com, DCs in China, or the Amazon ones, and all that automation. But automation is going to be becoming much more prevalent, and that is because there's the size of the market. The robotics market is growing, and it's continued to grow considerably, while the cost is going down. So we did a survey of tenants. So JLL did, and more than a half of the tenants surveyed rated automation and these kind of robotic technologies very important for their business. Now so of course we have to to understand that there's a difference between robotics, there's a difference between IoT, connectedness. So the different aspects of automation, and finally, being a digital company. So being able to track, all your inventory and your products across the supply chain. So there's various aspects when we're talking about kind of becoming digital. Now, what we see here is that so if we split the kind of automation between the established automation, and this is your kind of typical ASRS system, and then your emerging automation, which is your, for example, your AMRs, your robotic case picking. So what we see here is that both of these kind of automation are expected to grow in the future. And of course, at the moment, if you look at the micro level, every company will say, okay, what is the business case for me putting an AMR? So the example at the bottom, this is kind of a trolley, AMR trolley. So, why should, this will move with 300 kilos of payload to transfer goods to a carousel, for example. So why should I adopt this, right? I have people to do it. Well, it's true. This business case depends on a country-to-country basis. So if it costs you $50,000 to get this AMR to allow you to move 300 kilos of goods to a carousel, this would replace at least one headcount for you. So how does that translate? When is your payback if you save one shift of a one headcount? So in Singapore, in a year it would be $30,000. So if it costs $50,000, you will need 20 months to pay back. In Thailand, it will be almost half that, for example. So you need to be able to replace at least 2 or 3 shifts in Thailand to make an AMR affordable. So again, the data show that the adoption is growing, but at the end of the day, even for a simple trolley AMR like this, a business case will have to be done. Now, I mentioned before that automation is not just about robots. One very important one is sensors, and especially in cold storage. So this is an example of Linear Logistics. Is one of the biggest cold storage logistics providers. They have a global footprint. They have in ANZ, they have China, they have Vietnam. So they installed thousands of connected temperature sensors in their warehouse. And what they did is they used machine learning to regulate energy usage throughout the day. And as a result, they managed to reduce overall consumption by a third over 3 years. So this kind of automation, it might not be as sexy as looking at robots, but it's very vital, and it will, and having that kind of automation, those kind of warehouses that can be fitted with these sensors will be critical to be successful and to be able to operate in very cost competitive markets like in Southeast Asia. Now, on the sustainability front, so look, everybody kind of hears in the news, hears the heat waves across the globe at the moment, and the science is clear. We must keep global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels to prevent kind of the worst effects of climate change. But it looks like, and you can see in this graph, that by 2100 we'll see an increase of between 3 to 4 degrees as global emissions continue to rise. So the Paris Pledge was kind of fear. So even the Paris Pledge is quite above where we should be, but the current trajectory is even higher as far as global emissions. And I mean, let's not forget, from a JLL point of view, real estate is responsible for 40% of the world's global emissions. We, on our part, JLL is committing to achieve net zero carbon emissions across all JLL occupied buildings by 2030. And we do advocate a net zero approach to our clients and our suppliers as well. So we see these trends are already in the news, and at least multinationals have sustainability very high on their agenda. So even when we talk to a lot to investors, they're asking, that's a check that the facility will have to take before they want to invest. They don't want to invest in logistics facility that are, they are not green. Now, it's not just about climate change. It's actually about profitability. So what's your total shareholder return, and what's the impact of being sustainable and your ESG score? So this is an interesting graph that companies that are pursuing plans to reduce emissions have generated a much better total shareholder return. So basically, here's almost 10 percentage points higher than of their peers. And Unilever is a good example. Unilever, I guess we always hear it on the news as far as sustainability is concerned, because of course they have set the goal to reach their net zero emissions by 2039. But what they've done is also they've tied their supplier emissions tracking to invoicing. So they invoice depending on your supplier emissions, and so to reduce the total supply chain carbon footprint. And they have cut 1.5 billion through sustainable sourcing since 2008. So sustainability makes sense both from a climate point of view, but also from a profitability point of view. And already there are multiple initiatives in place. There are the science-based targets. So, for example, Woolworths has signed up to a commitment target. So there are around 300 companies in APAC that have signed up for science-based targets. There's the net zero carbon buildings commitment. So this challenges businesses, cities to reach net zero carbon in operations for all their assets under control by 2030. And of course, there's also the UN Asset Owner Alliance. So we're talking about kind of owners of real greenhouse gas emission targets. That's by 2050. So many companies are doing this. Many companies have their targets, and real estate and logistic real estate. It also has quite a big impact in the carbon emissions. And we see developers like GLP. So GLP have formed a 50-50 joint venture with Brookfield, a developer, to build China's largest platform for distributed solar energy on the rooftops of their warehouses and commercial buildings. So they basically intend to become the largest rooftop solar power provider in China. And of course, nations and cities are already taking these commitments seriously. Now, what this means for us, for example, JLL, we work with companies who want to look at their whole breakdown of their emissions and of their net zero carbon, even from building construction. So the kind of material they use and how they can be disposed, and of course their operation as well. So this will allow them to, depending on the rating system they use for a warehouse. For example, in Australia, they have the green mark. The more kind of whole life they are as far as their net zero carbon, the more they can achieve those six ticks. So closing, there are many features that could be installed in a warehouse, or at least as a tenant where you're leasing a warehouse. You'll be able to check. Many of the MNCs have their own sustainability teams that check that it meets some of those features, and then what is the green impact? And that green impact is translated through your sustainability report, through the UN Sustainability Development targets, and you can kind of quantitatively see that impact. And look, there are many frameworks in place. For example, this is the well-being framework, and at different levels of commitment you can reach. So it doesn't need to be, you don't need to kind of go all the all the way there. It's starting and getting the basics right and ensuring the warehouse is able to track at least the some of those measurements. This is an example of Goodman. So Goodman is a developer in Australia, warehouse, where we help to accredit them and get their green star rating. And actually, one of the other things we did is we, as I mentioned, location from a supply chain point of view, where you're located also impacts your sustainability score. So if your location requires a lot of transportation, so because maybe your location is cheaper, but it requires twice amount the effort in transport and the cost in kilometers, rather than another location which maybe is a bit more expensive, but this will amount to a much bigger impact to your carbon emissions. So we did a simulation where we looked at the inbound and outbound movements for that tenant that was going to go in this new warehouse, and the typical kilometers measure that they would need to reach their customers. And this is another way to evaluate and showcase that your supply chain takes into account sustainability. So the warehouse of the future, within the four walls, again, consider technological innovations, sustainability commitments, and depending on the locations. Now we're talking about APAC. Obviously a multi-story warehouse is not appropriate to all cities, but as urbanization comes to us as a requirement to be able to deliver fast more products and more reliably, it will mean that we will need to be closer to the cities, and we will need to have more space in those warehouses to deliver more products. So I think I just over my time a bit. So this is what I want to share, and now just want to pass it out to MC to see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Michael Ignatiadis. I think that your presentation is very useful and insightful, and kind of like that we have a question from the floor for the two questions that we would like to ask. Let me start with the first that. What is stopping warehouse developer building more modern facility in Thailand?
Right. I mean, look, in Thailand, I mean, you have to, first of all, you have really two, is a duopoly. You have WHA and Frasers, who I think they have 80% of the market. Again, coming back to my earlier point, it's not about, I think everybody ideally would want to have a modern facility, right? Why not? Why not have a multi-story, modern facility, grade A? But the challenge is, will the tenant pay for it? And at the moment, in the last at least 5-10 years, most tenants it didn't make financial sense for them. They would like to, but it didn't make financial sense. But saying that, as I mentioned, that there's the trends we see in the market for which are going to be supported by technological innovations, by the cost going down for robotics, for automation, plus the sustainability commitments. This would mean that there's going to be another kind of top-down reason why tenants will be looking for those facilities, and will be willing to pay. And at the moment, we do have demand. As I say, in the Philippines, we do have demand for modern, grade A facilities, multi-story. But the challenge now is that even multinationals can be a bit short-sighted and they don't want to invest. But in Jakarta, for example, we have logos building a few of those multi-story warehouses, and they're all full now. And so there is demand, and we'll see more of those being developed very soon.
All right. Thank you so much for that question. And this is the last question, is that how can companies avoid disruption in their supply chain?
Well, I mean, there's no insurance against disruption. So I wouldn't say there is a secret recipe to avoid disruption. Mm-hmm. What companies can do is, and I mentioned in one of my slides, is how to calculate the time to recover and the time to survive for some of the critical parts of the supply chain. and be able to say, yes, I can live with that disruption if something happens. I can live with disrupting my customer deliveries for X amount of time. But in the back of it, of course, digitization, so being able to see and understand where your inventory is, where your product is, when your suppliers will deliver the raw material. So that kind of visibility is a given nowadays, because otherwise you can't measure your time to recover, your time to survive. You don't have visibility in what is happening in your supply chain, and that's pushing companies to invest more in software and in system implementation as well to get that visibility going.
All right. Thank you so much for your contribution and your answer to the question from the floor. And your presentation today is very useful, as I told that, because everyone in the logistic industry would like to adapt themselves in order to weather about so many factors, especially for after the pandemic end. And with your insightful presentation, this we're going to give us a guideline useful for that. So once again, thank you for Mr. Michael Ignatiadis for joining this, and hope to see you soon for the next event to come. Thank you so much. Bye.
Yes, in Bangkok maybe. Thank you.